Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was originally released on May 26, 1967. It was the Beatles' eighth studio album. In 1968, it won 4 Grammy Awards and was the first rock album to ever win Album of the Year. The story is well known that the original inspiration for the album came from an idea by Paul McCartney for a song about a military marching band, and that this idea evolved into the idea of adopting the name of the band as an alter ego for the Beatles, and that the entire album would be a performance by this fictional band, and that said alter ego would free them from any preconceived notions of what a Beatles album would, could, and should be. At this point, the Beatles had retired from touring permanently, so the knowledge that they wouldn't have to perform any of the album's material live also led to a feeling that they could experiment freely in the studio with different instrumentation and arrangements that would have been impossible for them to replicate live with just the 4 of them. The Beatles had already been moving towards more experimentation with their last 2 albums, Rubber Soul and Revolver, and they were finding it harder and harder to replicate their new songs with just the 4-piece combo. In addition, they were tired of touring and tired of performing for audiences who screamed and made it mostly impossible to hear themselves perform. I have often thought that if the Beatles had not been able to quit touring, that it would have had a limiting and thus negative effect on their creative output. So I think it's important to note that without that, we might never have gotten the studio masterpieces like Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road, and so on, so on. Now, as far as I know, this is the first time that I have heard of a well-known music artist adopting an alter ego. And while I can't think of any artist that attempted this prior to Sgt. Pepper, there have been plenty who have done it since. A few examples include Damon Albarn of Gorillaz, Garth Brooks as Chris Gaines, Beyonce Knowles as Sasha Fierce, Bono as Mr. McPhisto, and even Paul McCartney as the Fireman. Not to mention the master of musical alter egos, David Bowie. Over the years, there has been some debate as to whether Sgt. Pepper does in fact qualify as a concept album or not. Some say yes, albeit a loose one. Others say that the concept is too loose and that it only introduces itself at the beginning and then fades away by the 3rd track, only to reintroduce itself at the album's closing. This last analysis is correct, but I would say that Sgt. Pepper is a different kind of concept album. The concept of musical freedom. What happens when a band is freed from having to tour? Freed from the pressure to have to adhere to what is considered commercially viable, or what their audiences feel that they have to be. Track 1, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When the track opens, we first hear the sounds of band instruments warming up and the sound of audience chatter waiting for an imaginary concert to start. As a kid hearing this album for the first time, the illusion worked perfectly for me. With my headphones on, I really could imagine that I was there at a live concert. From the outset, there is a musical conversation between the rhythm section and the lead guitar, with the rhythm section asking the question and the lead guitar answering. Sgt. Pepper is written in the key of G major, but it opens on in a 7th chord, which creates a slight tension for the first 2 bars. The tension is continued when it jumps to a C7 chord, before it does finally resolve to the G major. It's a completely musical and non-lyrical way of saying, pay attention everybody, something is about to happen. No, not that something. Sorry. That's a video for another day. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but when the guitar, bass, and drums kick in, there is no instant applause from the imaginary audience in attendance. Even when Paul starts to sing It Was 20 Years Ago Today, there is still no applause of recognition for the band. And this is because Paul is only introducing the band. Once he announces the band's name, there is a thunderous applause, and one can imagine the curtain suddenly going up as the band, Sgt. Pepper, and not the Beatles, is revealed to the audience. Now here's the part that tickles me. The original idea for Sgt. Pepper was a military marching band, and upon announcing the name of the band, the first thing we hear is the horns. These would be primary instruments for a military marching band, and this is when the audience starts applauding. This would imply that the rock band at the beginning and Paul's introduction is the Beatles introducing the act you've known for all these years, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In this imaginary scenario, the Pepper Band has been around for 20 years. They are clearly, within the fictional universe of this album, legendary. The announcing of their names elicits thunderous applause that even the Beatles themselves can elicit. Of course, this is all an imaginary scenario in my head, but I think there is a wonderfully delicious comic irony to all of this, that the Beatles are just the backup band for a military marching band, who are bigger stars than them. Now the lyrics tell us who the Sgt. Pepper Band is first with Paul's introduction, and then the band reinforces this when they take the stage. A common motif that I find in hip-hop albums is an opening song wherein the artist tells us, the audience, who they are. This is especially true when it is the artist's first album. And once again, I have always wondered why more rock artists and rock bands don't try the same trick. But the Beatles, to the best of my knowledge, did it first, even if it was for their fictional alter egos. But along with introducing us to the band, the lyrics are also warm and inviting. They put us at ease and tell us to sit back and let the evening go. One of the things I enjoy about this song is the juxtaposition between the guitars and the horns. The horns open with a very classical musical motif and melody, and then the guitars just bang with a heavy, almost metal-style rhythm. Check out the guitar rhythms at the 1 minute and 3 mark for an example of this. There is another sound texture that has always put a big smile on my face, but also always made me wonder too. As the horns begin, there is this burst of audience laughter. I know it's an imaginary audience, but I can't help but wonder, what was so damn funny? What happened on stage that made that audience laugh? For years I've wondered this. Now that I own the Sgt. Pepper Deluxe Edition, I know that Paul was thinking of people like me when he did this. In the enclosed hardcover book, McCartney talks about growing up, listening to comedy shows on the BBC radio, and how there would be moments when the comedian performing said nothing, but that the audience started to laugh at something visual that the comic was doing, and that it would make his imagination run wild, wondering what happened. He mentions that adding the canned laughter was meant to do the same to the audience listening to the album. And in my case, I guess it worked. We are never supposed to know what happened, and that's the point. And it's one of the many little details that just makes me smile when I listen to this album. Track 2, With a Little Help from My Friends. After a little bit of musical vamping, we are introduced to Billy Shears, the alter ego for Ringo Starr, and there is more wild applause and even screaming from the imaginary audience. In the opening lyrics, Billy Shears sings for forgiveness. What would you think if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song, and I'll try not to sing out of key. There is such a universal sense of earnestness to this lyric. How often have we all wanted to just open up and sing, but we're afraid to because we felt we weren't good enough, or we were afraid of what others might think? Ringo may not be the most technically gifted singer on the planet, but what he might lack in range and chops, he makes up for in personality and earnestness. In fact, from what I've read about the recording of this song, Ringo was hesitant to sing it at first, perhaps concerned that he wouldn't be up to the task, but the other Beatles kept encouraging him, And so life imitated art, and Ringo got by with a little help from his friends, John, Paul, and George, who were kind enough to sing along with him. During the song's pre-chorus, there is this subtle bit of dark tension over a C-sharp minor to an F-sharp 7 chord. This would be the question and answer portion of the song where the band sings, "Do you need anybody?" and Bill answers, "I just need someone to love," which resolves on the much happier E to D to A major chords. Let me emphasize those chords on the piano for you. Tension. Resolve. Tension. Resolve. I do have to pause and wonder on the fact that only Ringo's alter ego gets a name. I think it's too bad that we never got the alter ego names for John, Paul, and George. I think it would have been nice if they had at least been named in the liner notes somewhere, or better yet, why not in the Yellow Submarine movie, since we do get appearances from both the Beatles and their Pepperland alter egos. Now, I realize that this next part is just me way overthinking everything, something I know I'm prone to do, but since the Sgt. Pepper Band in Yellow Submarine play concert band instruments, then perhaps this is an indication that the music from Sgt. Pepper the album is actually coming from the Beatles' alter egos from the Yellow Submarine movie. Now, I realize that the movie Yellow Submarine was created later, and that all of this is impossible since the filmmakers borrowed ideas from the albums to make the film. But I think it's fun to think of it that way, especially if that Yellow Submarine movie sequel that I dreamed about one night ever happens. Yes, I really did once have a dream that I was sitting in a theater and watching an animated sequel to Yellow Submarine. But the Yellow Submarine sequel that I saw in my dream is a video for another day. Now at this point, the concept of the live performance ends, or perhaps just fades into the background, as we no longer hear the audience until the end of side 2. Track 3, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Over the years, many myths regarding this song have come and gone, the most common being that the song was about LSD, and thus the title, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I remember reading an interview with John Lennon in Playboy magazine, one of the last ones he gave before his tragic death, where he stated the song was first inspired by a drawing that his son Julian had created while still in nursery school. John asked him what the drawing was, and Julian replied that it was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lennon then goes on to state that the rest of the lyrics were inspired from the book Alice in Wonderland. Paul McCartney has also confirmed this as well. But in spite of the song not being about a drug that we all associate with psychedelics, it is interesting to note that the song is inspired by both a child's drawing and a children's book, albeit what some readers, including myself, see as a very psychedelic children's book. Basing the song on a children's book and a child's drawing is reinforced by the very nursery rhyme-like feel to the lyrics. Picture yourself in a boat on a river, with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly, a girl with kaleidoscope eyes. Prior to Ringo's drum cue, the song is performed in 3/4 time or waltz time. For me, this also adds to what I refer to as the whole as seen through the eyes of a child motif that embodies this song. As a child, I can remember being fascinated by a music box that my mother owned. You opened it up and a waltz played while a little mechanical ballerina danced. And so I've always associated the musical motif of a waltz with childhood. The song is written in the key of A major, and it starts with an A major chord. And if you just play the root note and the third note, which is A and C sharp, and then descend the bass line down the scale, you get this. You might be tempted at first to think, oh, okay, it's just an A major chord with a descending bass line. But when you bring the bass line down, it changes the chord voicing so that it is now A major, A over G, F sharp minor 7th, and then what we call F plus. Picture yourself in a boat on a river. Or playing this chord progression gives the musical effect of not so much falling, but drifting away. And this adds to that whole lullaby effect, as if you're drifting off into dreamland. This is all, of course, before Ringo's drum cue, after which the band breaks in, and the song switches to 4/4 time, and it becomes a rock song. The song's chorus, or second half, is in complete opposition to its first half. While the verse is dreamlike and gentle, the chorus is raucous and in your face. The lyrics on the verse are elegant and multi-layered, whereas the chorus is just the song's title repeated over and over. In the stereo mix, John Lennon's vocals are bare at the beginning, but in the mono version, there is a strange bit of phase-in effect that adds to the psychedelic feel of the song. Both versions of John Lennon's vocals are enjoyable, but in the new 2017 stereo remix, it sounds like Giles Martin has given us the best of both worlds and has mixed both the phased and bare vocals together. Track 4, Getting Better. It's getting better. This song opens on an F major chord, but a second guitar, and I will assume that it's George Harrison playing that second guitar, is playing a double octave G note. This changes the voicing of that chord to an F add 9 chord. Like that. This is once again just an adaptation. You're trying to combine this with this, so I would play it solo like this. It's getting better all the time. It's these kind of subtle music voicings where one guitar is playing one thing and the other is playing another thing that has added so much color to the Beatles songs, and at times puzzled and perplexed guitarists trying to cover them. In keeping with the theme of Sgt. Pepper and a military marching band, the song is played with a strong military marching beat, albeit a happy and positive one. I have always associated the sound of this staccato, high-pitched opening with a number of things. Radio waves traveling through the air, a human pulse, and an alarm clock going off. I know that radio waves and a human pulse sound nothing like this, of course, and unlike a real alarm clock, the alarm clock on this song is anything but annoying and off-putting. And if the opening of Getting Better is an alarm clock, it is an alarm clock that is waking you, the listener, up to a brand new day of endless possibilities. In interviews, Paul McCartney has stated, in regards to Getting Better, that he likes to write about positive things because it cheers him up, and he knows it will cheer up others as well. Written by both John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Getting Better is a tremendously uplifting song about changing your life for the better, and yet there are some very dark themes being dealt with within the song. In the third and final verse, John and Paul both sing, "I used to be cruel to my woman. I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved." In later interviews, John Lennon admits that this verse is about him, that he used to fight men and hit women, and that the violent nature of his past was why he embraced the ideology of peace and love in his later years. Interestingly enough, though, while the song may deal with some dark themes like violence to women, within the song's lyrics, it is a woman who is responsible for the protagonist of the song's conversion from dark to light. Paul McCartney sings, "I've got to admit it's getting better since you've been mine."
It's getting better since you've been mine.
Throughout the recording process on this track and the rest of the album, the Beatles only had access to 4-track tape machines. Getting Better is one of the more complex arrangements on the album and required 10 unique tracks, including the use of a tambura, an Indian instrument played by George Harrison, at the 1 minute and 36 mark of the song.
I used to be cruel.
In the recent Giles Martin 2017 remix, this instrument has really been brought out to the forefront in a very nice way. Squeezing 10 individual tracks onto a 4-track recording machine is not easy. This would be done by recording 4 tracks on one machine, and then mixing and bouncing them down to just 1 track on another machine, and then recording another 4 tracks, and then mixing and bouncing them down to 1 track again, and so on and so forth. Track 5, Fixing a Hole.
I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in and stops.
Fixing a Hole is a very simple song about a hole. If you don't fix the hole, the rain will get in. You need to fix the hole so that the rain won't get in. And then you can get back to letting your mind wander. Just kidding. There is certainly more to it than that. The opening chords for Fixing a Hole is F major to C plus to F minor 7th to a B flat 7th, and is performed by George Martin on harpsichord. Played on the harpsichord in 8th notes, the song opens with a very classical music motif. This motif, though, is delightfully betrayed by the closing B flat 7th chord. Played on the harpsichord, it for the most part fits into the light classical feel of the opening. But played on piano, and the B flat 7 chord's strong blues/jazz feel is much more noticeable and belies what's to come. Here's the opening to Fixing a Hole on a harpsichord. Here it is played on piano. Now listen to that last chord on piano. Very jazz sounding, very blues sounding. It's a kind of musical misdirection, and if that is too subtle a clue, right after that comes Ringo's brief swing drum fill that also lets you know that this song is about to change direction. Fixing a Hole, like Lucy in the Sky, is another song that was at first considered to be a song about drug use, and in particular heroin use. If you are a heroin user, the way that you fix the hole is with a needle. Paul McCartney has denied this and described the song more as being about renovating your life. In the Steve Turner book, A Hard Day's Right, he describes it as allowing himself the freedom to close off the cracks and holes that allowed the enemies of his imagination to leak in. In other words, a song about doing what needs to be done to keep the negative and debilitating thoughts out and letting the positive and enabling thoughts in. Like Lucy in the Sky, the song's primary chord progression to the verse is a descending chord progression that gives a similar drifting away-like quality like I mentioned in Lucy. This becomes more apparent when I play the chords slower. So first we have the descending chords. I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in and stops my mind from wandering, And through that, you've got this bass where it's just the F to the C, which also adds to that kind of swaying motion, even while the chords are descending. When the lyrics get to the "where it will go" part of the lyrics, the chords are swaying back and forth between the F minor 7th and the F minor 6th chord. And this swaying back and forth the chords does help emphasize a lot of mystery to that line in the lyric. Listening to the song as a kid, that part always filled me with a wonderful sense of mystery that made me wonder where it will go. I would get a huge question mark in my mind about this. Where does your mind wander? It's interesting to notice how well it ties in thematically to the song that preceded it, Getting Better. They both deal with the same basic theme of self-improvement. Getting Better is dealing with it in a very direct and literal way. Fixing a Hole is being much more lucid and dreamlike about it. I also think it's fun to note that the song's opening, while in a classical mode, also carries a bit of that circus carnival feel to it, thus foreshadowing side one's closing track as well. I also want to give another shout out to Paul's rather inventive bass line on the "Where It Will Go" section as well. The bass line walks up to, but never lands on the root note of the chord that it's walking up to. You keep expecting it to land on the F. But instead it does this. It never lands. Track 6, She's Leaving Home. I am almost tempted to skip over this track and say nothing. After all, what can I say about one of the most beautiful 3.5 minutes or so that's ever been written and recorded in popular music? She's Leaving Home is the only song wherein none of the Beatles are playing any of the musical instruments on the track. The song features 4 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos, double bass, and harp. And then John and Paul providing vocals. I had always figured that George Harrison might be harmonizing with them, but the notes on the hardcover book from the Super Deluxe edition of Sgt. Pepper credits only John and Paul as providing vocals. She's Leaving Home picks up where Eleanor Rigby left off, as this is the second time that orchestral instruments and orchestral instruments only provide the musical accompaniment for a Beatles song. The song is in the key B major and opens with a harp melody. Underneath the melody is an E major chord, voiced in 2 voicings, the first here and the second here. At first glance, it would appear that the melody played over these 2 A major chords are just an E major chord arpeggiated. And this is correct on the first half, but on the second half, we have the notes A, B, C sharp, E, and G sharp. Here's the E major chord arpeggiated. Here's the second half of the melody. If you play that second half as just a chord, here is what it sounds like. Play all of these notes together and they create an A major 9th chord. It sounds surprisingly bright and upbeat for such a sad and somber song. It also sounds like sunrise too. Now play these 2 chords over each other and they don't make any sense at all. Here is the chord played over an E major chord. Played together as chords, they don't really work. But arpeggiated over the E major, it's wonderful. It's well known that the inspiration for the song came from a news story about a teenage runaway that Paul read about. Paul created the verses and showed it to John, who created the chorus, dealing with the parents' point of view. The back and forth of the lyrical point of view between the parents and the young girl create a story where you feel sympathy for both characters in the story. This motif of having more than one character point of view is quite common within the realm of musical theater, but is fairly uncommon and unconventional within the realm of pop and rock music, as most popular songs only voice a singular point of view. I can think of few pop and rock songs, though, that take this approach. Don't You Want Me by the Human League is an example of a multiple POV approach in a popular song. If you have the Super Deluxe edition of Sgt. Pepper, you get two wonderful instrumental takes of She's Leaving Home. It's amazing to note just how wonderful just hearing the orchestral instrumental arrangement is, even without the vocals. Track 7, Bean for the Benefit of Mr. Kite.
For the benefit of Mr. Kite, there will be a show tonight on trampoline.
Bean for the Benefit of Mr. Kite stands in sharp contrast to She's Leaving Home. While She's Leaving Home is melancholy, Bean for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is, for me, quite menacing. In interviews, John Lennon has stated that he originally was not all that impressed with the song himself, and that he considered it as just something that he tossed off because the album needed a song. It's well known that his inspiration for the song was from a 19th century circus poster, and that pretty much everything mentioned in the song is from that poster, except that the horse's name wasn't Henry. Once again, this would lead some to interpret the song as being about drug use, stating that Henry the horse was a reference to heroin. It wasn't, of course, but for me, listening to Bean for the Benefit of Mr. Kite as a kid, the song took on a very dark and menacing quality. The song is meant to evoke an old-school circus carnival, and it does. But for me, this song transcends its source material and evokes a carnival that is taking place in the pits of hell or in someone's fevered, dreamed nightmare. The song's opening instrumental melody juxtaposition of major and minor chords creates a tension that sets the stage for this dark carnival. The juxtaposition of chords on the opening melody is a B major, an A major seventh, a D minor, to a G. It's interesting to note that D minor is the only minor chord, the only chord that has a dark sound to it. And yet the other chords preceding it just still have this tension to them. We get a little bit of release from that G major at the end, but that's short-lived though. For instance, the second chord played is an A7th chord. By itself, it has a bit of dissonant tension, but the opening note of the melody played over it is a second space A note. Play or sing that note over the chord, and we have some very serious dissonant tension. Now, one of the things that adds to this is that melody. When you get to that A7th chord, the note played above that on the melody is an A note. And that adds a lot more tension right there. That's where the chord hits. And then, like so. And then after that introduction, the chord structure played underneath the verse has this very kind of chiller, thriller, horror theater type of sound to it. I could have envisioned this like on some old anthology TV show that played old horror movies. One of the things that I think always keeps the Beatles songs interesting over repeated listenings is the very subtle levels of variation within repetition. As an example, during the first verse, the structure is bass note, chord, bass note, chord, bass note, chord. Slight little change there, but still bass note to chord. Most other bands would have just repeated that same motif on the second verse, and once again, done the same thing, like so. But in the second verse, Paul McCartney changes up the bass, and he goes, he lands on an A, and that's a variation right there, just the landing on the A, because the first verse lands on a G, second verse lands on an A. Little variation right there. But also, when you put that with the chords, instead of bass note, chord, it's... There you go. When the line, "a hogshead of real fire," hit my ears, I imagined this giant, disembodied, blood-red hogshead behind a black night sky with a ring of fire blazing behind it. I realized that this was probably not John Lennon's intent, but to me it all came off as quite horrific and thrilling, like an old-school Hammer horror film set to music. In my review of the session tracks from the Sgt. Pepper Deluxe Edition, I mentioned that the earlier session recording of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite comes off a bit more pedestrian and less menacing than the final version does. In spite of all the melodic and lyrical elements that I have mentioned here, what really adds the final touch on this song is John Lennon's final vocal performance and George Martin's production. John Lennon lets out just enough restrained menace in his voice, and George Martin also adds just the right level of studio effect to make him sound like the circus ringmaster of some other dark dimension. Also is the rather bold production decision to cut up various tape clips of different organ and calliope performances, have them thrown up into the air, and then reassemble them at random to create the song's very dark, hallucinogenic ending. This gives a very haunting ending to side one of Sgt. Pepper. You know, if you read a novel and suddenly you reach a cliffhanger ending at the end of the chapter, you are very compelled to turn the page and keep reading to see what happens next. And I feel that back in the days of vinyl, ending side one of your album on a dark and ominous note like this would have had a similar psychological effect on the listener and made them want to flip that vinyl record over and get to side two. I realize, of course, there is no continuation of the story, but I think subliminally it has the same effect on the listener. Track 8, Within You and Without You. This was the only track on the album written by George Harrison, and the only track that featured none of the other Beatles except for George Harrison. Written while at the house of musician and artist Klaus Voormann, Harrison's inspiration for the song came from a conversation they had shared over dinner regarding the metaphysical space that prevents individuals from recognizing the natural forces uniting the world, which is why the song opens with the words, "We were talking about the space between us all." Lyrically, it combines both Eastern and Western religious ideas. The opening line of the song is taken from Hindu teaching. In order for us to draw closer and give up on the space between us all, we need to give up on the illusion of ego and realize that we are essentially all one. And yet later in the song, the line about gaining the world but losing your soul is taken from a quote by Jesus in the Gospels. It's interesting to point out how in an unintentional bit of coincidental similarity to the song's lyrical themes that Within You and Without You is also performed by both Eastern and Western musicians. In the book A Hard Day's Right, George Martin states that organizing the Indian musicians who don't read music was easy, but that creating a score for the Western musicians so that they could sound like the Indian musicians was very difficult. He goes on to compare how one Indian musician would be doing all kinds of swoops out of sheer improvisation and familiarity with his instrument, and how he would then have to find a way to score this for Western classical musicians, who could only play what you put on the printed page for them to read. This would prove very challenging when it came time to record A Day in the Life, but more on that later. In many ways, indie musicians make a much better match for rock musicians, since rock musicians rarely ever read music and also rely a good deal on improvisation as well. Written in the key of C, the song is composed around one chord, or should I say around a fifth chord interval in the key of C. A fifth interval drones throughout, while the vocal and instrumental melodies dance around the sustained interval. If you look at the published sheet music for Within You and Without You, you will see absolutely no chords written. In the bass clef, you will just see a C bass in octaves, either droning or just kind of moving up and down, while the melody moves around that. Not even a C chord is written, probably because it's all based, I think, on fifths. A lot of Indian music is sometimes. Let's play it and check it out. It feels like chords are changing, but they're not, ever. Within You and Without You is the only song written by George Harrison on the Sgt. Pepper album. And in my opinion, alongside of A Day in the Life, it is one of the most epic songs on the album. Part of it is the lyrical themes that he chooses to explore in this song. Another portion of it, though, I have to give credit to George Martin's stellar production on this particular track. Pay particular note to the pizzicato strings that fade in and out during the song's rather epic instrumental break. For many years listening to this album, I always wondered about the burst of laughter at the end of the song. It turns out that George Harrison just wanted to add a bit of levity or lightness to the end of the song after being very serious for over 5 minutes. It was probably not intentional, but it ends up working quite well as a segue to the next track. Track 9, When I'm 64.
Need me, will you still feed me when I'm 64?
You know, my mother really likes this song, but I'll get back to that in a moment. The song is credited to Lennon and McCartney, but of course history has shown that the song was written by McCartney when he was 16. Lennon has stated in interviews that the Beatles would perform it whenever their amplifiers broke down or the electricity went off during the early Cavern Club days. Apparently there was an acoustic piano in the club to facilitate this. There has also been some reported accounts that Lennon and McCartney added the Grandchildren on Your Knee, Vera, Chuck, and Dave section before recording it for Sgt. Pepper. For this track, Paul McCartney performed the lead and backing vocals, bass guitar, and piano. John performed backing vocals and, interestingly enough, lead guitar. George played guitar and supplied backing vocals, and Ringo, of course, plays drums and tubular bells. Session players Robert Burns, Henry Mackenzie, and Frank Reedy were brought in to perform the clarinet trio, which featured 2 B-flat clarinets and 1 bass clarinet, all of which was arranged and scored by producer George Martin. By the way, my apologies in advance if I have mispronounced any of the names of any of the session musicians who played on this track. I'm not worried about it though, because I know the internet will be happy to correct me if I do make any mispronunciations. If you listen to the bonus disc on the 2017 deluxe edition of the album, you will get an early take 2 version of the song, which features just drums, bass, piano, lead vocals, and some of the guitar on the breakdowns. I am guessing that McCartney probably performed the bass and vocals with Ringo on drums first, and then added in the piano as an overdub. What's nice about this early take is that you get a rare opportunity to really hear some of Ringo's excellent, but oftentimes overlooked and understated cymbal work. And Giles Martin also brings this out on the 2017 remix. This sparse Take 2 version also helps to illustrate just how much the clarinets and tubular bells and the backing vocals do to elevate this song. At about the 37-second mark, the song transitions from Tin Pan Alley to a kind of light classical music. So we come out of that last "When I'm 64," and then we have this surprisingly classical sounding little interlude here. Let me play this for you. Of course, that all changes when we hit that C. Now, getting back to my mother. My parents grew up in a different musical era. The big band era of Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller was their era. And there was this huge generational divide when it came to music between myself and my parents. But when my mother first heard me listening to When I'm 64, on the record player in my bedroom, she came in and commented, "Oh, I remember this song. They used to play this song back in the 40s. This would have been in the 70s, and I told her that this song was recorded by the Beatles in the late 60s. She responded, "Yes, but this is an old song from the 40s, and the Beatles must have re-recorded it." I showed her the album sleeve and showed her that the writing of the song was credited to Lennon and McCartney. She shook her head and said, "No, I remember this song from the 40s. It's a really good song." I have never been able to find an earlier version of When I'm 64 by anyone other than the Beatles. All I can say is that Paul McCartney wrote a song so convincingly of another period that my mother believed it to be part of her memories. And it's amazing that he wrote this song at the age of 16. Yes, he may have gotten a little help from his friends fleshing it out for this album, but the major musical and lyrical themes of the song were created by a 16-year-old. Again, amazing. Track 10, Lovely Rita. Okay, so you all know that Paul McCartney wrote the song about a real female traffic warden. It's always been kind of assumed that the ticket was issued to Paul personally. But in the accompanying book to the deluxe 50th anniversary edition for Sgt. Pepper, it's revealed that the title of the song came about when a visiting American friend remarked to Paul McCartney that he hadn't realized that the UK had meter maids until he noticed one issuing a ticket. The term meter maid was an American term, and one that Sir McCartney had not heard before. But hearing it was obviously enough to make the light bulb go off in his head and make him think to himself, "Aha, there's a song in that." Unlike the previous 4 tracks on side 2 of Sgt. Pepper, which required outside musicians to complete their respective visions, Lovely Rita features the Fab Four handling pretty much all of the instrumentation, although producer George Martin does perform the very lively piano solo during the instrumental section. Also, Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison performed the comb and paper kazoo notes that you hear after the line, "Made her look a little like a military man." Yes, that section is being performed with comb and paper. Now, the key that the song was actually played in versus the key you hear it in are two different things, because after the basic tracks were laid down, the tape speeds were slightly modified here and there as more tracks were added. You can find the low-down nitty-gritty info on this aspect of the recordings within the pages of the hardcover book for the 50th anniversary edition. However, The standard published sheet music has the song written in E major. Once again, the Beatles defy convention and just go with what feels right by not starting on the root chord. The song starts on a repeating B-A-E-B descending chord structure that helps to support a dreamlike atmosphere on the song's opening. But the verse opens on its root chord of E, becoming more musically straightforward in order to better support the song's lyrical narrative. After the last verse, the song returns to its dreamlike opening for 2 cycles, and then abruptly jumps into A minor. Lovely Rita is written in the key of E major. In the key of E major, F, G, C, and D are played as sharps. So we are coming out of the last section of the song where we sing the chorus, Lovely Rita, Mita maid, lovely Rita, Mita maid. No sooner does that measure end when suddenly we have an A on the bass and we're playing thirds. And even though it's not written as such, it sure sounds like A minor. I sometimes think that the Beatles' lack of music theory education and their desire to not copy themselves often led to unintentionally interesting musical choices, like the sudden key change ending to Lovely Rita illustrates. At this point, I do have to pause and cut off at the pass what I know will be some internet music theory trolls. I am sure that there are more than just a few of you out there who are just chomping at the bit to correct me and inform me that the published sheet music has the entire song in the key of E major. They've simply just flatted or turned all the notes that should be sharped into naturals. I am well aware of this, and you know what? It doesn't really make a difference. They could have just as easily saved themselves some ink from having to flat all those sharp notes and put it in the key of A minor for its closing. Either way, it accomplishes the same thing. For all intents and purposes, the ending of the song is in A minor. It is a key change, even if it's not written that way. Internet music theory trolls dismissed. This sudden switch to A minor creates an unexpected, dark musical ending to what is otherwise a very cheery and upbeat song. All the vocal moaning and heavy breathing that accompanies this section add to the effect, and always made me think that a lot more happened between Rita and her sisters and the song's main protagonist than we are led to believe. I guess I'm not the only one who thinks this, because I can remember a pre-internet interview where Paul was asked this question. He denied that there was any sexual connotation to any of it, stating that the song's lyric explicitly states, "Took her home, I nearly made it, sitting on the sofa with a sister or two," meaning that Rita's sisters made sure that no funny business went on. But for me, the music will always tell me otherwise. Track 11, Good Morning, Good Morning.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning.
Of all the tracks on Sgt. Pepper, it's Good Morning, Good Morning that benefits the most from Giles Martin's 2017 remix. I'll be honest, I love the Sgt. Pepper album. I love every song on the album. But if I had to pick a least favorite song, it would be Good Morning, Good Morning. Sgt. Pepper is an album about a fantasy band. The album opens as a fantasy concert, and dreamlike musical and lyrical motifs play throughout. And perhaps that's why it's always felt a bit out of place with the rest of the album. The whole album itself feels very blissful. Even in what I perceive to be its darker moments, there is still this underlying blissfulness to it. But Good Morning feels erratic and out of place with the rest of the album. At first you might think that a darker dream is beginning to intrude on your blissful one, but then you realize it's the waking world that's intruding. The song deals with John Lennon's dissatisfaction with suburban home life, and there is a manic depressive feel to it. A lot of that manic depressive feel comes from how its musical timing is structured. From a music theory standpoint, Good Morning, Good Morning is strangely structured for a pop song. First of all, and as I have implied before in other videos, writing a pop song outside of standard 4/4 time is not common, and when it does happen, it is by itself unusual. Writing a pop song that switches between time signatures is even more unusual. Good Morning switches time signatures 3 times. The song's first 4 measures are in the comfortable 4/4 time. The next 3 are in 5/4 time, before jumping to 3/4 time for just one measure, before jumping back to 4/4 time, or what is sometimes referred to as common time. And I believe that it's the song's awkward time signature jumps that do the most to create this song's effect of feeling disoriented. In this case, it's the disorientation John feels when faced with what I'm guessing must have been the banality of suburban life sinking into the head of someone who has for years now been living a life extraordinary. This makes sense when you consider that one of the song's inspirations was a Kellogg's Cornflakes commercial, and that the lyrical reference to "It's time for tea and meet the wife" refers to a British sitcom about a henpecked husband. And again, I doubt that John Lennon was ever thinking, oh yeah, if I go from 4/4 to 5/4 to 3/4, it will create the vibe I'm going for. I get the impression that he had no idea what he was doing from a music theory perspective. I'm guessing he knew instinctively the feel he was going for. He picked up his guitar, and I think he just let his instincts guide him all the way, not once stopping to think, wait, what the hell time signature is this in? Just like I said with Lovely Rita, unintentionally interesting and even brilliant musical choices. And getting back to my opening statement about this track benefiting the most from the Giles Martin remix, in the remix, Mr. Martin gives a bit of a tweak to where the guitars sit in the mix, giving the guitars, and thus the song, a much stronger and harder edge that it didn't have previously. In the hands of Giles Martin, Good Morning now sounds more like a precursor to the White Album. Track 12, Sgt. Pepper Reprise. As I said before, Sgt. Pepper is an album about a fantasy band playing a fantasy concert, and we return full force to this theme in the reprise. We hear Paul give a count-off, and George, or is it John, I'm not really sure, say in the background, goodbye. The first thing that hits me is how much heavier and stripped down the Sgt. Pepper reprise is from its opening track predecessor. Ringo kicks out one of his most straightforwardly heavy rock drum beats ever on this track. When I listen to Ringo's drum beat, I can kind of imagine that Gene Simmons and or Paul Stanley of Kiss might have pointed to Ringo's drum beat when telling Peter Criss how they wanted their hit, Rock and Roll All Night, to open. The guitar, bass, and drum riffs that open the reprise predates a lot of heavy FM rock that will start to become more prevalent in the 70s and 80s. The opening Sgt. Pepper is relaxed and chill compared to the closing Sgt. Pepper. Gone are the horns and the light classical music arrangements from George Martin. Instead, it's just the 4 lads rocking out hard. My only complaint about the reprise is that it just ends too quickly. Or does it? Paul shouts out to the audience, the final chord is strummed, and the crowd roars. But before the audience can even have a chance to die down, there is... I'm sorry, pardon me while I digress. You know, if there is any one thing to dispel the superstitious notions regarding the number 13, it is the presence of track 13. A Day in the Life. This is the big one. The song opens with the applause fading from the Sgt. Pepper reprise. John's acoustic guitar fades in and floats above it. Enter a very majestically played piano chord. The concert is over, but something even more amazing is about to begin. Enter John Lennon's opening vocal, which George Martin would years later describe as spine-chilling. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. The opening line to A Day in the Life describes a dark comedy. To this day, I wonder, what was so sad about this so-called lucky man? What great fortune had turned so tragically wrong, and yet was so ironic at the same time that it made you have to laugh? He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. In this second verse, we go from the dark comedy of life in the first verse to the dark comedy of death in the second. But in the third verse, we leave both the dark comedy of life and the dark comedy of death for the world of dreams, as represented by the dream world of cinema, and then in the last line, to an altogether different kind of dream world. I saw a film today, oh boy. The English army had just won the war. A crowd of people turned away, but I just had to look, having read the book. I'd love to turn you on. Lennon and McCartney deny any drug references to songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Fixin' a Hole, but they have never denied the drug reference in A Day in the Life. It has been reported that the first drug reference is the line, "He blew his mind out in a car," and McCartney has confirmed in recent interviews that the line, "I'd love to turn you on," is definitely a drug reference to LSD. To sum up, a little over a minute and 40 seconds, and we have already touched on life, death, and dreams. And then the real journey begins as the orchestra takes us on what I can best describe as a sonic representation of an acid trip. This amazing orchestral glissando is the centerpiece of A Day in the Life. A lot has been written about the recording of this section. Improvisation was common for musicians playing rock and blues during this time period, but from listening to George Martin in interviews, orchestra players of that time frame had no idea how to improvise outside of anything that wasn't written out for them in advance. Both John and Paul expressed the desire to hear an orchestral build during the song's instrumental sections, but lacked a musical way to express how it should be played. To help them realize their vision, producer George Martin wrote one of the loosest and most unconventional music scores ever. He wrote starting and ending notes for 24 bars of music, with reference notes along the way as to where they should probably be for each bar. He marked the beginning of the section as pianissimo at the beginning and fortissimo at the end, which translates to start as softly as possible and to build until you end as loudly as possible. Then he told the orchestra members to do something completely contrary to all practical music thought and experience. He instructed them to not follow each other. The performance of any piece of music between two or more players requires that the players pay attention to and follow each other so that their performance locks in and syncs up. George Martin told them all to be individuals, every man for himself. If the fellow next to you is a third away from you, assume that he's going too fast and stay on your own personal course. This is contrary to the rules of any musical performance in any genre of music. I want to stress that everything I have just said has been written elsewhere, but I bring it up here to illustrate the contributions of their producer George Martin. The song was originally recorded without the orchestra, 24 bars of count-off left open for something they would add later. John and Paul had an abstract idea of what they wanted to hear, but it took the classically trained musical mind of George Martin to bring it to fruition. To me, there is no argument who the so-called fifth Beatle was. It was George Martin. While I have nothing to back up this next statement, it seems probably likely that numerous takes of this particular section were recorded so that just the right take could be chosen. There is so much that one can visualize when hearing this section. The closest comparison that I can give to describe the mental images that hearing this orchestral section gives me is the interdimensional journey sequence from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Sometimes I can imagine that I can see myself flying through that sonic light trip. It's the ultimate trip through time and space when suddenly it screeches to a halt and we wake up.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across.
And we awaken to the banality of everyday life. Or do we?
Had a smoke, and somebody spoke, and I went into a dream.
And then we are back to John and the dream. Or was that last part really the dream, and was everything previous to it reality? A Day in the Life begs the question, what is dream and what is reality? Queen would state it more plainly in their 1975 epic, Bohemian Rhapsody, which I would argue is their A Day in the Life. I would be remiss if I didn't discuss Ringo's drum performance during this song. Ringo starts by playing pianissimo. His drums begin at first by matching John Lennon's acoustic guitar strum, and by doing this, he doesn't really so much begin a drum beat as he sneaks it in. It's just a pulse, really. To quote the movie Amadeus, it begins almost comically. And then his drums take on a very classical, timpani-like feel. Oftentimes, a lead guitarist might play little melodic lead guitar breaks between the lead singer's lyrics to serve as musical bridges between the verses. Elton John does this a lot. He bridges the melodies that he sings in his verse with short piano melodies that he plays in between. Drums are not a melodic instrument. They are a rhythmic instrument. But in A Day in the Life, Ringo does this with his drums. And he does this without the advantage of having access to musical notes. After the fourth verse, the orchestral musical equivalent of the acid trip takes us on a second trip through the cosmos of our mind before landing and ending majestically on a final E major chord. Or does it end? A Day in the Life's ending chord rings on and on. As a kid, I would listen to this album with headphones and keep turning it up during its long extended fade. It's meant to give the impression that it might keep ringing on into eternity. It doesn't, of course, and yet I can't help but think that in some other alternate universe that it didn't end there, and that it was just faded out at a convenient spot for some existential universe DJ, and that in that other universe, you can fade the volume back up, and before the piano chord fades out, we hear a crossfade of that same chord playing back in reverse, and thus fades back up, transitioning into the next musical section of A Day in the Life. This crossfades into a crazy drum introduction by Ringo, and then George Harrison begins to sing about, well, since we only know the version that exists in our universe, I think it would be pointless to talk about the version that exists in another universe now, wouldn't it? But trust me, if you ever make your way to alternate universe number X2186, check out that universe's version of A Day in the Life. It will blow your mind. In my humble opinion, A Day in the Life is perhaps one of the most amazing feats of popular recorded music in the 20th century. 50 years later, it's still above damn near anything else that has come since. When I first heard A Day in the Life, my jaw dropped. It was an utter revelation for me. I was just a kid and my definition of pop music was very limited until I heard this song. No other song has quite illustrated the idea that in music there are no limitations to where you can go in the way that A Day in the Life did. And no other song has quite illustrated to me the idea that pop music can be anything, and that the only rules it has are the ones that we impose on it. And so the Sgt. Pepper album comes to a close. Or at least it did for many decades prior to the CD era. In addition to the album's 13 tracks, the Beatles recorded an audio tone that could only be heard by dogs right at the end of A Day in the Life, and then they recorded a bit of incomprehensible gibberish for the album's runoff groove. All vinyl records have what is called a runoff groove at the end of each side. The runoff groove puts your needle in a perpetual play loop so that it doesn't slide over into the actual record label and cause possible damage to the needle. If the Sgt. Pepper runoff groove still existed by the time I was listening to it on vinyl, it would have been completely overlooked by the existence of automatic turntables picking up the needle before I could hear it. When the album came to CD, the runoff groove was created with a fade out. But if you play a new pressing of the album on a turntable without automatic return, it will play on and on indefinitely until you get up and take off the needle. Allegedly, it has been reported that you are hearing one voice saying, "Been so high," and another saying, "Never could be any other way." But when listening to it, it has always felt like what is being said is, "Never goose me any other way." Play it back and tell me if you hear it too. It's been so many decades since I first heard the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. And in all those decades, I have never grown tired of hearing it. Yes, I may put it away for a while, but I eventually always come back to it. It never ceases to amaze me, thrill me, and entertain me. And when I listen to it now, decades later, I hear more than when I first heard it. The Beatles had certainly been building up to this album with their previous releases of Rubber Soul and Revolver. Their experimentation with different sounds and their cross-pollination of different musical genres was just beginning to bloom on those albums. But Sgt. Pepper blew the door wide open. I also believe that history might have gone very differently if the Fab Four hadn't stopped touring when they did, because I am certain that this album, as we know it now, would not have been possible if the Beatles and George Martin had not been able to work on it uninterrupted in the way that they did. Freed from the financial obligations of touring, the Beatles and their producer, George Martin, were given the opportunity to deliver a musical masterpiece to the world. This is TJR, and when I began this analysis of Sgt. Pepper, I asked myself, is this really a good idea? After all, what can you say about this album's songs, its song structures, and the recording process that hasn't already been said numerous times over by so many other music historians already? And so while I did bring up some facts that I'm sure you may or may not have already known, I have also tried to relate those facts to how the album resonated with me on a more personal level. I want to thank you for watching this analysis and for letting me share my thoughts on how this album resonated with me. But I want to also add that, in the end, how it resonates with you is what is most important. If you like this video, please be sure to click like, click subscribe, and click the bell icon so you can know when I release new videos. Thank you everybody so much for watching. Once again, this is TJR, and stay passionate about the music.